As we are running short of time, we are commencing to the next session. The next session is going to be depression in old age. The speaker is Dr. K.S. Saji sir. And I like to welcome Dr. G. Suresh Kumar sir and Dr. J. Babu Bala Singh sir to the chair as a chairperson to the dais. We welcome you, sir.
Dr. Suresh Kumar, chairperson, practicing at Visakhapatnam, well-known neuropsychiatrist, a member of IPS South Zonal branch. Dr. G. Bala Babu Singh, chairperson, assistant professor, Tanjavur Medical College, general secretary, IPS Tamil Nadu chapter, member of IPS South Zonal branch.
Over to you, sir.
SARS biodata. Welcome, sir. Saji, sir.
Hello.
Sorry for the delay. The previous session is so extended and prolonged. I'll keep you waiting.
It's okay, sir. I'll make it brief.
No, not like sir. But of course, I have to. But of course, Professor Saji doesn't require any introduction for South Zone. He is a professor of psychiatry and a professor and head of the Department of Psychiatry at Government Medical College, Thrissur. His areas of interest is in the public mental health and geriatric mental health. He had more than 40 papers to his credit in indexed journals. He is an associate editor of Indian Journal of Psychiatry, Indian Journal of Psychological Medicine. He has received the award of Vimla Virmani Award by Professor Surinder Mohan Marwa Award. And also he received the ICMR International Fellowship for the Biomedical Scientists for the year 2021. Today he is talk on the depression in old age people. It is very common, the depression in old age, most of the time under-recognized, under-treated, under-reported. So we are running short of time. I request Babu Bala Singh will.
I am a great admirer of Dr. Shaji, and he has done a lot of work in dementia, as Dr. Steer also would be knowing, and especially at the community level. And he is much interested in treating people, old age people with psychiatric illness. And I was stunned to see his community work. He has developed, I think, on community center. I think it is a long back, if I'm not wrong, sir. So he has done a very good integrated community work on patients suffering from dementia. And I'm not standing before this lecture, and I want Dr. Shaji to take the.
Thank you, sir. I think, thank you, South Zone, especially Dr. Ramakrishnan, for inviting me. I take this as an opportunity to inform certain or present few ideas. It's not a very comprehensive presentation on the topic, but then I am trying to generate some interest in certain areas which are not generally mentioned when we talk about depression in late life. It's a global problem. Depression is the commonest mental health problem. About 30% of people above the age of 65 will need some kind of psychosocial support or intervention because of their mental health problem, and most of it is due to actually depression. Though dementia, as we heard from Dr. Subhashini and Sridhar, that's a huge problem, but it is less frequent than dementia, which may be 5 times more prevalent than dementia. Then there is this issue called mild cognitive impairment. And of course, there are older people with late onset psychosis, but more than that, more and more people with psychotic disorders are getting into late life. That's another issue. let us focus on depression. I think the whole idea of today's talk is to highlight certain things in general about depression and what does it mean to be depressed when you are into later years of life, and how multimorbidity is a reality in management of geriatric depression, and then how biological aging, see whether you have diabetes, depression or hypertension, you continue to age, and how does that interact with the multimorbidity which you have. Then trying to highlight certain emerging information about frailty and things like that. So that is the whole idea of today's talk. Cognitive symptoms are very common. I'm not getting into discussion about dementia, pseudo dementia, nothing like that. But we all know that functional impairment is quite common when you have a mental health problem. It's not necessary that you need to have mild cognitive impairment or dementia. You can have depression. Yes.
Rajesh sir, can you,
Yes.
any screen share is there? Want to didactic lecture?
No.
have a-
Is it visible? My slides, are they visible?
No, you are visible. You are not. Slides are not visible.
Oh, really? Sorry. I had done screen sharing. Maybe I'll do it again. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please do, sir.
I'm sorry about it. Is it visible now?
Yes, sir. Now, sir. Yes, okay, sir. Fine.
Yeah. I'll continue with whatever we started with. Is that okay now?
Okay, sir. Fine.
Multimorbidity is very common. We have not missed anything. It was only title. So I think depression is more common in care homes than primary care, and it's also prevalent in community. Only difference would be in the community you have mild to moderate depression, which is much more prevalent, whereas in tertiary care and institutional settings you might have major depression or other conditions like that. This is very important for everyone to know. Depressive symptoms are so common, it could be threshold depression or subthreshold depression. By threshold depression, we mean that the person's symptomatology would qualify for a diagnosis of an episode of depression, which could be mild, moderate, or severe. I'm not getting into the studies. There are variable methodologies. About 25%, out of them 5% less than 5% actually will be having what could be designated as an ICD-10 major depression or a severe depressive episode, or 20% would be mild to moderate. It's heterogeneous. We are again, this talk will not allow us to get into the details, but then cognitive impairment could be due to depression, or you can have depressive syndrome superimposed on a pre-existing mild cognitive impairment. So usually the fundamental disturbance is that you have slowing of information which affects all kinds of cognitive functioning. It can be there very much in depression. It's very simple. It's just common sense that when you are depressed, you have some functional impairment. If you have some functional impairment due to other causes, you could also get depressed in response or along with the same problem. So one could cause the other. Again, just trying to get your attention into this major area. If you get an episode of major depressive disorder or a severe depressive episode, then whatever disease which you have, the outcome of that disease will be negatively impacted. For example, if I have an arthritis, chronic arthritis, if I get an episode of major depression, then the outcome of arthritis also will get affected. Same may be true for hypertension, stroke, or whatever. So it is very, very important to prevent an episode of major depression in a person who is into his later years of life. It is at times difficult to differentiate between mild cognitive impairment and depression. And you can have actually mild cognitive impairment and depression along with that. Then we will use some time to elaborate on frailty and multimorbidity. Very common. 65% of people above the age of 65 will have more than 2 disorders and would qualify for multimorbidity. Why am I trying to sell this idea of multimorbidity? We must recognize it, because the moment you have multimorbidity, the outcome is likely to be poor when compared to a person with single morbidity. But that's okay. Much more problematic is that if you have multiple medical problems or physical conditions, then the way health services is going to respond to your needs is very bad. I'll show you that. This is what multimorbidity increases with age and more with mental health disorder. I presume depression is the commonest multimorbidity condition in late life. This is the problem with medicine now, or especially in the last few decades. We have treatments which were developed for people who are middle-aged and with single disorders, and then we provide that to everyone with any number of disorders, hoping that that will help them. So bundling of treatments which are proven to be effective for single disorders is what you get when you have multimorbidity and you seek help. So I think it is time that medicine changes itself to address the issues which are very, very particular with multimorbidity, which is the most common problem when an older person is seeking help. We are still under the presumption that if I have diabetes and hypertension, I should get treatment for diabetes plus hypertension. We must actually, the science, medical science should investigate the possibility of my diabetes and hypertension working, interacting negatively, and even the treatments interacting negatively, adversely impacting my outcome. Take, for example, diabetes and dementia, or fracture and dementia, falls, fracture and dementia. So all this very, very complicated. We need to see when things are complex, we should not try to simplify it without investigating the complexity. We are delivering treatments, especially in hospitals where specialties are very strong. They tend to bundle treatments. Take the situation. Sridhar was talking about the usefulness of SSRIs to treat depressive symptoms in dementia. But then there is no good evidence to say that when you have dementia and depression, SSRIs will work the same way as when you have only depression. We are all aware of the risks of antipsychotic drugs in older people, especially when they are given. There was, in fact, indiscriminate use of these drugs many years back for control of behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, which I think is not correct, not advised. And integration is also not, putting many specialists into care and they individually treating people with whatever they think is the right thing. A generalist approach which is multidisciplinary, is the important thing for management in depression. I think paucity of time is there. But then we had this incident in a trauma center of one hospital. There was this person with injury just below the eyebrow. It is not on the eyelid. it is not eye. It's so there was this doubt whether plastic surgeon should stitch or general surgeon should stitch or of that, because there was a zygomatic arch fracture, there was some trauma to the face. So, nobody was wanting to own up. People would do their bit and get out. So that is not good for older people. I should not be seen by 5 people who think differently. And I should get advice from one person. This is the emerging culture of, supermarket. You want shampoo, you go to one section. You want food, you go to another section. So, that should, older people should not be made to wander in the supermarket and pick up what is available there. They should be provided what is needed for them. Nobody seems to be looking at that. And as was mentioned, reduction of burden is very important. You will quickly look at this thing. Imagine a person who is 65 plus, has diabetes, hypertension, mild cognitive impairment, arthritis. He is continuing to age, and aging catches up with you in the later years. So how do all this interact and develop into negative outcomes? That is very important. Biological aging in a person with cerebrovascular disease may be slightly different from biological aging in a person without cerebrovascular disease. So I will not broadly, again, to tell you this, that a person could have an executive dysfunction because of cerebrovascular aging, which is faster in a number of people. Or it could be that I have an inflammatory disease and thus I have an inflamed and thus slowed brain. Or there is mitochondrial aging, which is faster in me, and then maybe I'm more frail and fatigued. So there could be, these are presumptive interactions between aging and morbidity. It is quite fast, and we must be very honest in saying this, we have not really understood the biology of aging as much as we want to. So that brings to another issue of frailty, which is very common. I think we can, if you observe people closely, you can get a feeling that they are getting frail and more frail and more frail than they were before. Definition is very simple, though it is long. When you are using your reserves, when every system is sort of reached a level where they are working on reserves, then you have a problem. In terms of, you develop a health problem, your outcome is liable to be poor. And then you are more prone for disability, death, or hospitalization than a person who does not have frailty. If frailty is about 15%, then it increases age, as was discussed in the earlier session. Women, it may be more in women than men. Not same as disability. The concept is that you will become frail, more frail, and then become disabled later on. So if you could identify, this is hypothetical, if you could identify frailty earlier, and if we do not have, as of now, interventions to postpone or slow down frailty, actually we may be preventing disability. That is something for all of us to think and work on. Since frailty could be 15% and depression around 15%, obviously there will be people who are frail and depressed. So that's a problem, and those people may be at higher risk for falls. For example, depressed and frail may be more prone for falls than a person with only depression and no frailty. These are emerging areas. It's conceptualized as something which is unrelated. It could be that my frailty and my depression may be unrelated, It could be also that they all, both frailty, my frailty and depression emanate from the same biological substrate, to say simply. Or it could be that they are distinct and one makes the other one worse because it could coexist and lead to poor outcome. There are measures. We'll not go into details of those because, again, these are not very concrete measures, but it seems that these measures are becoming user-friendly. There is some work going on in our institution regarding this. Obviously, we need to learn more. Research shall focus on frailty, multimorbidity, its interrelationship, potential for reversal of disability by identifying these things earlier. We discussed this. Again, one thing which they have done in the West with better healthcare facilities over the last, say, few decades, they have succeeded in compression of morbidity among older people. So older people in the age group of 80 plus and all are much more functional in healthy developed economies than other places. So that's a possibility, and there is a scope for active aging there. Coming back to frailty, multimorbidity and late life depression, these things could bring, or late onset depression could bring on frailty. That's one possibility. Again, this is for research. Coming to implications for services. What is the implication of frailty, multimorbidity, disability, mild cognitive impairment, possibility of these things coexisting, and things like that? What is the implication? I think the most important thing is that though we are mental health professionals, we need to take a holistic approach. This was mentioned again and again earlier, that we should see all disorders. It's very common, even when there are 3 or 4 obvious disorders, there could be some more which are undetected. When you have 3 or 4, there may be 5 and 6 which is not yet uncovered. So we need to develop clinical practice guidelines for depression when it is associated with multimorbidity. We need guidelines for management of late life depression when it is associated with diabetes, for example. So these are possibilities which we can discuss. It's a emerging public health issue. It's not same as depression which starts in early life. It's not same as depression in younger or middle-aged people. It's different. Diagnosis itself is difficult. We said early dementia versus mild cognitive impairment versus depression with cognitive symptoms is going to be very difficult. Then coming to choice of interventions, imagine the time when we were trainees, there was no drug called SSRI. So it was very difficult to give anticholinergic or drugs with anticholinergic potential like tricyclic antidepressants to people with the late life depression. So choice of drugs, it should not have anticholinergic effects. Sridhar was very clear about that. So we know, or we must presume that most people in late life, especially when they have depression, their cognition is on, they are using reserves probably, or they have reached the threshold of a cognitive disorder. What kind of psychosocial interventions? We must very seriously think, especially people who are practicing in cities and high-tech hospitals. What is the kind of psychosocial interventions which are feasible? Follow-up care. How I remember again, I was listening to the earlier session. I was a caregiver for my mother all throughout my life, I must say. She developed dementia later on, but then before that, she had chronic medical problems. See, it is not For older people, the services are not user friendly. You will see one consultant, then you will have to wait for 2 hours in a busy general hospital lobby to see another consultant. So we have to transform services and then make. And she never wanted to visit doctors and hospitals. She had very plainly told me that you will treat me or I will not get any treatment because I can't. I'm fed up with these settings. Side effects are a matter of concern. It was very good that Dr. Subhashini was talking about GI bleeds and hyponatremia, which is a very common thing. Fall prevention should be there on everybody's agenda. Whoever treats older people, whether they complain of propensity to fall or not, fall prevention is hugely important because we are going to create or increase the risk of fall. We'll not talk about tertiary care here because tertiary care is quite self-sufficient. They will know. But then general hospital settings, we need to really find a space for older people. I'm not talking about physical space. There should be space in time and, quiet places, the ones which, easy, user-friendly spaces where people could come, wait for you and then listen to you patiently, and we all should be very patient in listening to them. We said this. Again, if you look at community setting, we had made mistakes there. Actually, when we ran the community program, there were people who were not detected to be depressed. They were not that bothered, mild to moderate depressive episode. Then we tried to treat, when they complained about insomnia, we tried to treat insomnia, using the same drugs which we use in, say, medical college or tertiary care setting. They were quite sensitive to the sedative side effects. So, this is one big problem of tertiary care training during post-graduation. We really believe that what we see in the community as depression is the same kind of depression which we see in, say, Institute of Mental Health Chennai or Medical College Thrissur or Kilpauk or wherever, Madurai Medical College. What we see in psychiatry departments are severe forms of depression. They are much more tolerant to side effects. And then we are in frequent contact with them. Whereas community is a different kind of thing. So probably non-specialist healthcare workers could be empowered to deliver simple intervention. Especially this is important. There is this DIL study, Depression in Late Life study. It is Amit Diaz, who is a community medicine person in Goa Medical College, supported by NIH actually. And then Vikram Patel was also part of the team. They have published quite a bit on late life depression, how important it is to prevent late life depression. That is one message I think I'm trying to emphasize here. There is fairly good evidence to say that depressive, or there is robust evidence to say that depressive symptoms are very common in late life. And now these groups have brought out evidence to say that those who have sub-threshold depression, maybe persistent depressive symptoms over a period of time, or mild depressive episode, they are the ones who will go on to develop major depression. So there is a case for indicated depression here. It is like you start treating borderline hypertension. So you could start with providing psychosocial interventions and call them up for monitoring through reviews. And the group from Goa had shown clearly that simple measures like problem-solving therapy, behavioral activation, and looking at management of sleep-wake cycle through the home care advisor, giving some social support, casework, and educating them to manage their multimorbidity, for example, diabetes or hypertension, can actually prevent incidence of major depression over a period of time. So they have shown, these are preliminary findings, which will have to be, if replicated, it becomes very meaningful. If you identify some people who seemed older people in their 60s and 70s, who seem to be having persistent depressive symptoms, that is the time when you should spend more time and provide them with psychosocial support as well as problem solving therapy. We of course will be happy to send you details if you are keen. I think this is by and large what I wanted to say. We need to base our care of older people with depression or depressive episode among people in their later years. It should be evidence informed. Preferably, if they are having mild, moderate episode, home or in and around home, if they could be supported on a long-term basis, we may be preventing major depression or early identification of depression. Though dementia is much more severe and disabling, depression by magnitude is very, very big, 5 times more prevalent than dementia at least. So it's a major public health challenge. I would rate depression as a major public health challenge of mental health type among older people. The message again, I think I deliberately and repeatedly said this: recognize multi-morbidity and manage all by either you should manage or somebody else should manage everything together. It should not be that neurologist's prescription is there, cardiologist's prescription is there, your prescription is there, orthopedician's prescription is there. Then they really do not know who is the, it's not, it should come into one prescription and one guideline and one doctor deciding, or a health worker who may be somebody like a nurse or a clinician like a general practitioner telling people what to do and what not to do. We must strengthen our outreach services. I think we hope to work on this little more in the next few years. I think this is basically what I wanted to say. I have tried to slightly rush through, but then I was very clear that I'm not trying to be very comprehensive here. I'm trying to sell this idea that if you look at depression in primary care setting, especially NCD clinics, which are very much there across the country, if you start looking at depression in people who come for treatment of diabetes and hypertension in primary healthcare centers where NCD programs are on by the National Health Mission, you will pick up depression. And if you provide psychosocial interventions through outreach services, you may be actually preventing major depression. And by doing that, we may be improving the outcomes of other morbidities which they have. I think frailty and multimorbidity and mild cognitive impairment, its interaction requires more research. This is what I wanted to say. Over to chairpersons. I think instead of 11:15, I was able to do it in that time. Over to you, sir. I'll stop screen share now.
That was a very excellent and lucid presentation from Dr. Shahji, who has not talked about pharmacology here. And he has very well highlighted the other aspects in the management of depression. And now the floor is open for questions.
Dr. Uday Kumar, want to ask?
That screen sharing is off, no?
Off, sir. Off, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Shahji Garu, do you
Yes.
see me, sir?
Thank you.
You were the past South Zone president, and then
Turned like that. Okay.
yeah, I just want to tell you all that Dr. Shahji was the South Zone president, and he was the founder of RCBC subcommittee of South Zone, which is really doing the best work towards the branch. Thank you for that, sir. In regard to prevention of either of depression or dementia, so there must be knowing. NIMHANS is doing a wonderful work. They have identified Srinivasa Puram in the KPH about 30 years of both the genders of normal people every day visiting them, and then every year they are doing all the psychological testing and including MRI to find out. It goes on, the study goes on, and finding what exactly the psychosocial biological factors have influenced to develop either of these psychological or dementia. Okay. And then tell us that these are the factors which have influenced to develop psychological or dementia. And then educating them, these are the factors, can be cut off and treated in before they're developing both the things, dementia or psychological problems, which is a wonderful study which is going on. My son is being involved in this study. I think definitely give us a light to understand what exactly the factors which would influence to develop the depression, or then and there the intervention goes on, and then prevent further developing the problems, which is a wonderful study, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Saji sir to respond.
Thank you. I think there are. It's very heartening to note that NIMHANS had taken up those as a very, with the geriatric psychiatry department and starting DM, and now lots of initiatives. It's happening across the country. Over the last 30 years, I think last 10 years have been really, really inspiring and very promising. I agree with you, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions from the floor or audience? If we are running short of time,
Yes.
Saji sir, it was a wonderful lecture. It is basically what is required in practical, the dealing with the older elderly people. Is not the depression alone. It is the multiple comorbidities at that age they are ailing. The reciprocal relationship with the depression and the comorbidities is the most focused individual. As you rightly said, at that age they are moving to one practitioner, one specialist to other specialist is very, for that this is very taxing and stressing to that individual. I think it is. What you said is a home setting or training the healthcare workers in this and strengthening the activities, the support outreach programs, and overall the social care and the individual early identification of the depressive symptoms, because most of the time it is underreported or under-recognized, the depression. If it have, and furthermore, the cognitive symptoms are further worsening. It causes complicating the diagnosis and the treatment. I think your approach is very wonderful, and the way you are narrating how the care, it is primarily not the treatment and the pharmacology is it. Of course, the multiple drugs, it causes further worsening of the things. He's already using on multiple therapies because of multiple ailments. He or she is on. That as my co-chairperson with the closing remarks.
One more question. Most of the old age depressions, over a period of time, they turn out to be demented. And now the concept is, apart from mild cognitive impairment, now the people are talking about mild behavioral impairment, which can behavioral symptoms like depression or agitation can precede the onset of dementia. So what is your opinion regarding this, sir?
I think it's very, geriatric psychiatry is very challenging, sir. I think what you said, I have treated over the last 30 years, many people thinking that they do not have cognitive impairment, they have pure depression, but then some of them had turned out to be dementia with Lewy bodies later on. So, you are 100% correct, sir. I think it's very challenging if someone in the 70s or late 60s get depression and some absent-mindedness. You do not know whether depression is producing attentional impairment or is he or she in for, maybe next 2 years will tell you. But then I am very honest in saying that tough cases, I am unable to predict. Some cases, you have a hunt, maybe, but then criteria-wise, you cannot decide. You get an intuition that maybe this is starting of dementia, but some cases, no clue, sir. I think it's very, very difficult. I agree with you, sir.
So is there any role of drugs like memantine? So though the patient doesn't have any cognitive impairment, can we start them?
I don't know. It's all manodharmam. And I think I have taken a very considered stand that I will not use cholinesterase inhibitors even in dementia unless there is definite indication. Because while I am happy that some improvement can be there with cholinesterase inhibitors, some people, especially with multimorbidity, can be harmed with these drugs. Slowing of pulse and syncopal attacks are not highlighted as much in the literature as they should be. So there can be problems also. So I'm not very, your question is depression, whether memantine, I'm not sure, sir. My answer is an honest, I don't know.
Thank you, sir, so much for your words of wisdom. And now I also make it a point earlier in my experience, a patient, when apart from depression, when you diagnose diabetes or hypertension, and I usually ask them to consult a physician. But over a period of time, even for next 3 or 4 visits, they have never consulted them. They come with the same raised blood sugar, and so then I made it a point that at least I should treat my patient with physical comorbidity. And I start them on at least to some extent hypertension or some common physical problem. I think we can put it under our prescription. And that is a good take-home message you have given to us. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the wonderful session you have given, sir. Thank you, sir.
Now I hand over the mic to organizers.
Thank you, sir. It was a fascinating session. Now I would like to call Dr. Sebastian, sir, to honor our chairpersons. Sebastian, sir, is coming.
Sorry, you should say.
You should face the mic. Face.
Also, we have a memento for speaker. It will reach you on time, sir. Will reach you soon.
The only one and only question and the best question and best suggestion, our president-elect, Dr. Uday Kumar, please come onto the dais. The memento will reach to Sajid, sir.
Thank you.
Speakers. you are showing will definitely will reach to you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, bye.
We are moving on to the next session. The session was on the topic non-epileptic seizures. It was going to presented by Dr. Dinesh Nayak. And the chairpersons are Dr. Srinivasan sir and Dr. K. Gangaram sir. Welcome to the dais, sir. Dr. Srinivasan sir, he completed his DPM and MD in IMH Chennai. He has over 36 years of experience. His special areas of interest is stress management, de-addiction, sexual dysfunction, and hypnotherapy. He heads Global Academy, where he conducts personality development programs and workshops for individuals and organizations. About Gangaram sir, he has completed MBBS, DPM from Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad. He is a retired senior faculty from IMH Hyderabad, presently practicing privately in Hyderabad. He has worked as a treasurer at Andhra Pradesh Psychiatric Society and treasurer in Telangana Psychiatric Society. He is a present treasurer for IPS South Zonal Branch. We welcome you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon and welcome for the last session of the conference. I'm really excited to be here because my good friend and long lost friend, Dr. Dinesh Nayak, is going to be presenting, and for a brief period we worked together. And even within that short time, we had a lot of interactions in a lot of cases. And he will be the ideal neurologist for the psychiatrist because he doesn't touch anything other than neurology. So he says, it's not my case, you take over Srini. That was the case. And the way he induces seizures with a tuning fork and suggestion, in fact, I used to be really jealous of him, the way at the drop of a hat he can do that. Even I, calling myself a hypnotherapist, couldn't do such suggestions. So it was easier. He used to make all the diagnosis and says it's a psychogenic non-epileptic seizure and it's everts. So a lot of unnecessary investigations and other things are avoided. And rightly, he has specialized himself into an epileptologist when he is heading a team of multiple neurologists in Global Hospital, where each person has a special interest and they work as a team, which is an ideal setting again, from competitive to collaborative nature. So that's the kind of person, a gentleman, and I'm really happy and eagerly waiting to listen from him. Now, over to my co-chairperson.
I will introduce the presenter. Dinesh Naik is a director neurology, head genealogist, Advanced Center for Epilepsy, Geneagils Global Health City, Chennai. Areas of interest is electrophysiology, pre-surgical evaluation of epilepsy, video EEG, intracranial EEG. He has 45 publications in national and international journals. It's over to the presenter.
Thank you very much, sirs, for the very kind introduction. And it's a great privilege and an honor for me to be here. And I thank Dr. Suresh and Dr. Rangarajan for having suggested that I should come and give a talk on this subject, which is quite dear to my heart. And I was really, immensely and pleasantly surprised when I met Dr. Srinivasan after many years. And I was just transported back to 2003, 2004, that golden period of about 18, 20 months where we worked together and collaborated so much. It had such a rich implications. My memories are refreshed of those days. Wonderful, sir. Thank you so much. I'm going to talk, it's not a comprehensive talk because it's a huge subject, and I'm not going to talk about the psychopathology of it at all because you're the experts in that. But what I am going to do is that as a practicing clinician in the outpatient, as well as when somebody comes to the emergency room with seizures, what should be the approach? And how do you diagnose something? And you got to keep this always in mind. Anything which is paroxysmal, episodic, we need to understand the circumstance in which these paroxysmal and events take place. So my talk is going to be very practical. I'm going to show a lot of videos and all taken by me and my team. But before that, I would like to just tell that an epileptic seizure, because this talk is on non-epileptic seizures. So the first thing is that we need to understand what is an epileptic seizure, because that's something which occurs as a direct involvement of the neurons in the brain, an excessive, sudden, rapid discharge of a group of neurons which work synchronously and then excessively, and then that produces. And if you have more than one unprovoked seizure, then you call it as an epilepsy. It's not just a single seizure, because single seizure can happen. It's not epilepsy. Provoked seizures can be there because in febrile seizure or due to hyponatremia or some other metabolic condition, you may have multiple seizures. That also is not epilepsy. But more than one unprovoked seizure is epilepsy. That is an important point. And the symptomatology of the seizure itself depends on which area of the brain the focus is, whether it's the frontal lobe or temporal lobe or occipital, etc. And so we need to have a good idea about the anatomical structures as well as the connectivity of the brain to understand how a seizure progresses. For example, if it is arising from the occipital lobe, the first symptom will be a visual aura. If it is coming from the posterior temporal, that visual aura will be in the form of a formed visual hallucination. And if it is coming from the parietal, then you have a vertiginous aura and a feeling of sensation of as if somebody is falling down. And then it progresses on to become a seizure. So that's important. So that's how we do. And then we try to lateralize it between right or left hemisphere. So this is lateralization and localization, for which we need to have a good understanding of the anatomical aspects of the brain. So again, nothing to beat detailed history and an accurate history, detailed description of the seizure semiology, how it starts, how it progresses, and how it terminates, and then the postictal phase, etc. We use a lot of video telemetry because in difficult cases, but other than that, a detailed history is most important. And now coming to the topic proper itself, that the psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, basically they are not epileptic. That's what it is. So that means it's not arising from the brain itself. That's very important to remember. But they resemble epileptic seizures. So that's the first thing. And it's not because of an excessive electrical discharge from a group of neurons, because it's not coming from the brain. And it's very important to remember that, that it's very common. It's very, very common. I'm an epileptologist, so I get a lot of difficult to control epilepsies. And when I evaluate them, I find that, and this is across the world, that about 1/4 of the patients actually have never had epilepsy. They might have been treated for years together with anti-epileptic drugs. And that's what it is. So prompt diagnosis is important. Exposure to unnecessary medication in about 80% of these people. And there are people who have been intubated. I'll show you 1 or 2 people like that. Now, just like how a regular epileptic seizure behaves, the non-epileptic seizure also can have the same manifestations. For example, you can have motor manifestation, you can have non-motor manifestations, very common, can occur as young as 5 years old. So age is not a barrier for having an epileptic seizure, so or non-epileptic seizure. So it's quite, you can have as young as 5 or 6 years old. Elderly are not immune from it. It's quite common to have elderly people also suffering from non-epileptic seizures. And you'll find that most of the time you'll have some kind of a stressor that is there. I'm not going to go into that. And most of the time, it is the psychiatric manifestation. Basically, it's a conversion disorder, basically. Factitious and malingering is very rare. At least in our practice, it doesn't really happen. So most of the time, it is actually a conversion disorder. I'm not going to do the psychopathology of that. How do you suspect? And this is very important. I mean, we have to make, and it's a diagnosis of inclusion. It's not a diagnosis of exclusion. That is very important. Again, if you think it's a diagnosis of exclusion, then we have to run through hundreds of different tests and then keep trying out medication, and that's the problem. So the clues, there are some clues to it. There is resistance to anti-seizure medication, emotional triggers bringing on these attacks, bilateral clonic movements without loss of consciousness, absence of post-ictal confusion. And we find that video telemetry is pretty helpful in this diagnosis. And variable responses with preserved awareness, out of phase movements of the extremities. So even though they have jerking of the limbs, it may be out of phase, discontinuous motor activity, pelvic thrusting, side to side head movements, eye closure and flutter. Generally in a true epileptic seizure, you'll find that the eyes are always open, it's never closed. That's a very important clue. And invariably, you know, you look at their face, they have some kind of a distressed expression most of the time when they are having a seizure. So these are some of the, and I find that that's a very important component. The distress is extremely important. Now, the EEG can be a pretty, dangerous tool. You should never depend entirely on the EEG for making a diagnosis or excluding a diagnosis. Movements during rhythmic movements may look like an ictal transformation during an EEG. So that's, and ictal transformation is usually a rhythmic activity in a real seizure. So an artifact can look like a genuine cerebral activity. So that's dangerous. So the absence of an ictal activity does not exclude an epileptic seizure, because a very focal epileptic seizure may not be seen on the scalp at all. So that's another point. So, and I will show you some examples of all of these. And so therefore the video EEG has, it's the gold standard, but it's also got some limitations. So that's it. So I'll go to the first case straight away. And sir, you can stop me at any time if you find that. Now, this is a gentleman. This is I'll go back, see the non-epileptic seizure presenting as drug-resistant epilepsy, a 47-year-old gentleman, again, happened to be from Coimbatore, actually. And he's been having seizures for the last, or episodes for the last 20 years. And his aura is of uneasiness and a fear and a drying of the mouth. So there are these autonomic features that he gets. Then he limbs stiffen and then he falls off. And it lasts for just about 2 minutes, usually less than 5 minutes. And the frequency, if you look at it once or twice a month, but in the last 3 years, it is about once a week. And this was in 2009 when I evaluated him. And he was resistant to 7 different anti-seizure medicines. He was actually on 7 anti-seizure medicine when he was referred. He was actually referred for potential epilepsy surgery. That's why. EEGs were reported as epileptiform. MRI was fairly normal because of these episodes of fall and that dizziness and all that. So he has undergone Holter monitoring, quite rightly so, because now I connect him to the video EEG. This is 10 years back or 12 years back, 2009. And you just see what happens to this gentleman. I'm just trying to suggest, okay, you may get an attack. Yeah, that's it. He actually falls off. It becomes completely unresponsive. EEG is going on simultaneously. This is a video telemetry. ECG is also going on simultaneously. So that's so that went on for quite some time, and then all of a sudden he just got up. But that's the episode, and then we confirmed with the relatives. It's very important that what you have recorded should be the habitual event, what he or she normally experiences. That's a very important. We have to confirm. And they confirmed, the attendants confirmed, the gentleman himself confirmed, yeah, this is what I get. So we were sure that we have recorded his habitual seizure. We always ask whether you have different types that you get, or is this the only type you get? He confirmed that this was the only type he got. And the EEG during the time of this prolonged unresponsive state was completely normal. You can see that the ECG is also going on. The last channel is the ECG channel, which is completely normal. So this was classical non-epileptic seizure. And you see his outcome after 10 years, and that's completely normal. You see, after 12 years of follow-up, he still comes with me. And this is about a year back. He's stable. He's off all anti-seizure medicines. Occasionally, when he's stressed, he falls off. But he knows that, okay, no, I can control it. So that's the kind of difference that you can make from 7 anti-seizure medicine to nil. And overall quality of life has improved tremendously. Now, this is another boy. You see that this is a 11-year-old boy. And I said that, non-epileptic seizures has no age groups. You can have any age. A 47-year-old I showed, now it's 11-year-old. You see, he had genuine epilepsy. He had benign Rolandic epilepsy, which is a very benign condition. It usually starts at the age of 5, and then it remits by the age of 9 or 10 or 11. That's what happens. So this boy had his last Rolandic seizure, which is usually a very oral jerky or in sleep. So that's what benign Rolandic epilepsy is. And then what happened was, after 2 years, he started getting daily seizures in wakefulness. So that's different from what he had in the past. So he was in remission or he has got cured of the Rolandic epilepsy, but then he has been falling down every day. And they had started anti-seizure medicine because the EEG was abnormal. And you just see, I'm trying to induce. I say that, okay, you may get an attack. And this is during the video telemetry itself. Again, you see this boy. Now he's assuming a kind of a position like this. You see, that's a kind of a dense unawareness. So he's absolutely no response. And that's a kind of a catatonic position. See, he kind of maintains it in the same way, doesn't drop. No response, waxy flexibility. And we are trying to elicit a response.
Look here. Show your thumb. Have a picture.
Absolutely no response. And then you see how he comes back to normal.
Nakanite.
at the end.
Show your tongue. What's your name?
See, now he will have a,
What's your name?
now he slowly is coming back to normal.
What happened this time?
So he says, I have no idea. So this is another classical non-epileptic seizure. His EEG at that time, during that episode, okay, you can see that the video and the EEG is going on. Now that shows only the interictal discharges, which is there is actually the centrotemporal spikes, which are classical of the benign Rolandic epilepsy. It's not an ictal event. So although you have an abnormal EEG of the past benign Rolandic epilepsy, the episodes that he is getting currently are not epileptic. So you may have an abnormal EEG, but the attacks are non-epileptic. That's another very important point. And all these conditions can be diagnosed in the outpatient. And you see that there is a characteristic thing that you make the person sit on the couch, and then you start suggesting that you may get an attack now after listening to their story. And the way they fall on the couch is, you see, they are different patients, but see the way they fall. It's always a gradual, and they make sure that they don't fall off the couch, but they precariously hang around on, like that. And that's very, very typical. And this is different patients, both males, females, but they all fall in the same way on the couch and in the outpatient. All these things can be diagnosed as outpatient. Now, this is a very interesting 37-year-old staff nurse, works in a major hospital. And at the time of work, she has had multiple episodes. 4 times the code blue had to be, because she almost went into so-called respiratory arrest and falling down bilateral convulsive, twice had to be intubated. And you see, I made a diagnosis in the outpatient. You just see what, this is a fairly long video, but I just tell that maybe you may get an attack that you normally would have got it in your hospital setting. It's very likely you may get. You see the expression on the face. You see the expression on the face. You can see that sometimes I said that most of the time in a non-epileptic, the eyes are closed, but sometimes the eyes can be open. So no single sign is true. You see the facial expression is, and then slowly it will, you see the grimace and the stare. You see that, and it's very interesting. I'm just telling you, you're likely to get it now. You're likely to get it now. And then she is responding in this way. And you see that she's making those, abnormal facial grimacing, and there's a contortion of the facial expression. And now she will start having some jerks. Towards the end, that's the jerk that she gets. And then she has those, you saw those kind of, that never happens in a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, and then she becomes completely unresponsive. And she has this overbreathing. You saw the expression on the face. And she was on 5 anti-seizure medicines. She never required even one, because she confirmed that this is my only seizure type. This is what I get. And then you could get a lot of psychopathology behind why she was having this. Her husband, drunkard, all kinds of things, but not looking after her and all that. The only place where she could actually find some relief is, getting some attention in the hospital. And that's what she was doing, because she's an escape mechanism. Yeah, this is a bank manager, a 59-year-old bank manager, repeated episodes of falls. Now, he was living in Tanjavur and working in Tanjavur, but his family is in Chennai. And the problem is that every time they'll call, he will call after some 9 o'clock in the morning and said, I've had a fall. And I had jerks, I've had seizures, and he was on multiple medicines. And again, I don't know why this work out audio first time work achieve, but it will work out, right? So again, you see, it's very simple that when you just make a suggestion, you see, he's trying to talk. There's a sound audio வரணும்பா.
Audio button on the player is at zero, so you have to raise it. உள்ள போங்க, audio button.
First slide வந்துதுப்பா. See, it would have been interesting to see the way he is telling his name. Like that, he keeps, he's in distress. You can see that the facial expression is an expression of distress, extreme stress at workplace. And this is what he gets. Unfortunately, all these things can be done in the OPD. You don't need real, investigations. And he's already had multiple MRIs, multiple EEGs and all that. But what required was the setting in which it would happen. And then you have a suspicion that this could be non-epileptic. You establish a rapport with the patient in the outpatient. It just takes only about 10 minutes to establish a good rapport and tell that, okay, I may be able to solve your problem. Now I want to see whether you're going to get an attack now in front of me. And I would love to see it. And that's it. And they almost 8 out of 10 times they would perform very well. And they get relieved also, because they'll say that, okay, fine, now we've got it, so don't worry. Now, this is a person, you see a software engineer, you just see a series of 4 videos and see how he acts. Unfortunately, the sound is not. You just see what he does. So you see, he is unresponsive. Okay. Just see whether. Just a minute. Update கொடுத்துமா? இதுல வருது பாத்தியா? பண்ணுங்க. Then it's some problem. Sound in America, it loses all its. No. Something to do with correct. First two ಬಂದಿದೆ. First two ಬಂದಿತ್ತು. ಆಡಿಯೋ இருந்தா நல்லா இருக்கும். Ah. Correct. Okay, so that's the first video. I'll just see how he's now started breathing a bit heavily.
Ram Kumar. எங்க இருக்கீங்க இப்போ? பெங்களூர். இப்போ என்ன ஆச்சு உங்களுக்கு? தெரியல, தூங்கி ஏன்னு இருக்காரு. இல்ல, இந்த மாதிரி தூக்கத்துலனாக்கா நம்ம சீக்கிரமா எழுப்பி விட்டுருலாமே. நீங்க எந்திரிக்கிறீங்க.
See now he will now get up.
நல்லா இருக்கீங்களா இப்போ?
Then the third.
கை தூக்குங்க ராம்.
Now the third.
கை தூக்குங்க.
Next slide.
கை தூக்கு ராம், கை தூக்கு. ஸ்டிஃபா இருக்கு. பேர் என்ன? அப்படியே வச்சிருப்பாரு.
Now next you see this video. Now he becomes like an animal, like I mean he says I've become a Narasimha Avtara. So he does that. You see this. A very interesting patient. The parents are used to it. Okay, now you see, now he starts crawling. You see that? See, then he like exactly like water. He has to do it to finish it. All this again in the outpatient. This didn't require any major. You see, and now he'll slowly come out of it. The mother is used to it. And now he wants water. You see how he drinks that water.
IPL, no? கல்யாணம் ஆயிருக்குல்ல?
And now he'll get relieved.
என்ன பேர் என்னப்பா?
See, now he's talking normally.
IPL தானே? What's your designation? Complaints and applications.
See how clearly he speaks. There's no postictal period. Now, just a minute back, he was crawling on the floor and is completely dissociated from reality. That's the striking nature. And he was also on multiple anti-seizure medicines because they just listened to his story and then paroxysmal. And they say that he's got lip smacking, then he's got water drinking and all that. So that's how. Now, elderly are not spared. All falls are not necessarily pathogenic. You just see this gentleman now, making him walk. He's walking nicely because this histories of repeated falls. Now you'll see the drama now. You see, he's just fallen absolutely flat. Now, when somebody comes with a history like that, no, sir, appo ulugurar, sir. Ulundu nyabam illam poraru. Absolutely no response. You see, there's no menace reflex.
Just do the dolls. Okay.
Absolutely no response in a 70-year-old gentleman.
Pulse rate is all right. Yeah.
Pulse rate was normal, so we check all those.
Okay. பேர் சொல்லுங்க.
Recovered. That's it.
When this video is ending.
He's become all right. So episodic falls. So if you just listen to the history, you would think something seriously wrong, and there'll be, hundreds of different tests conducted. Now, again, in the outpatient, you can actually get very nice videos of, generalized. You see this generalized tonic. You see how she's managing to lie on the couch, on the narrow couch, making sure that she's actually not falling off. And you see this out of phase jerking, posturing, tonic posturing, clonic jerking. And this lady has just come to the ER, having been treated overnight for recurrent seizures with low. In the ER, I suspected that this could be non-epileptic. You just see the thing. She is not yet counted into admission. And this is during the peak of COVID last year. There was a lot of stress and all that. And you see there, she starts getting the jerks. And you see this out of phase jerking. We just did it in the ER itself. You see the jerking, and she says that, yeah, that's what I get. And she was on, she had been loaded with 1,500 milligram of phenytoin. Because it was not responding, they gave levetiracetam. Because it was not responding, she gave lacosamide and then referred to us because it was drug-resistant status or impending status epilepticus. And that's it. And in the ER, we had a suspicion that, well, she looked quite cheerful actually. For somebody who's had recurrent seizures, she was actually giving a broad smile. That made me think, well, maybe, she may not have actually had. So that's a nice, this thing. And now, sometimes even in the video telemetry, if your staff is not well, fully aware, they get scared. You just see this boy, this girl, sorry, this is another girl in the ER. This happened just 4 days back. You see, she's a dental surgeon. She is a final third year dentist, dental surgeon. You see the opistotonic posture. You see, that's the arching of the trunk. That's one of the classical features of this, and then the jerking, like that. And that is very difficult to control. So even non-epileptic seizures can be quite difficult to control. And this girl, we had a very tough time to control her. You can see that, 2-3 people are standing next to her. And this is in the night. You see that kind of recurrent jerking. You see irregular jerking. And she was referred, she's a student in Savita Medical College and dental college. So that's the thing, that's the problem. So all these things. And then sometimes you can get very focal seizures. And focal seizures are generally like this. You see how very nicely she's actually generating very nice. You see, she's actually showing a very nice focal hemiclonic seizure. And you see, there's another feature of non-epileptic seizure is the hyperventilation. Very distressful. And the crying, that kind of an emotional cry. Yeah. So these are, now this girl, 16-year-old, just recently referred as autoimmune encephalitis. She's already had a CSF done, MR, etc. And what we found was that she was actually having these recurrent irregular jerking of the limbs. You can see that. You see that that's the kind of jerking that they get. Very nice. This is again just last month only, and was referred as because she was not responding to steroid, whether we should give rituximab because it's suspected autoimmune encephalitis, acute explosive onset in a young girl. You have to suspect autoimmune encephalitis, and you can see that they become a bit silent. And you see, sometimes focal jerks. And then later on, she'll start crying. Emotion, you can see that. She's crying. And that never happens in a typical epileptic seizure, in the post-ictal period. This emotional component, the distress, is a very important component when we think of non-epileptic seizure. So we always have to ask the history at the end of the seizure, what happens? Is the person happy or the person is crying? And crying is never a feature of very rare generalized one. Now this in the video telemetry going on, you see what happens. He has that tightening. You see his body becomes rigid, very tight, so tight that he stops breathing. Has become very, very tight, very rigid, arched. And you see that's yeah. So that's what happens. And they got scared because he was not responding, he was not breathing also. He's just held. So they actually, you see the next video, actually they started thumping his chest. They got scared. That can happen. And it was all actually non-epileptic. The EEG is going on simultaneously. The nurses were not aware of that. So for them, the first thing is to revive the patient. And you can see how dramatic these non-epileptic seizures can be. It can be quite harmless, but at the same time, it can be, lead on to a lot of. So that's the kind of thing. And again, we had a doubt whether this lady, who's been on multiple drugs, not responding well. So kept her in the video EEG. And she actually got a very nice seizure, which we thought, even we got confused, because she actually had a nice onset. You see, slowly there's a head clonic jerking, which happens in generalized, focal with generalized. Initially only head clonic jerking. Then she falls down gradually. Oh yeah, she slumps. And then she has these. And then she makes those sounds. This almost mimicked a normal, a regular seizure. And that's very, so we were all there, on the scene. Initially, I thought whether this is actually a real seizure, but we had the EEG simultaneously at the time. So luckily, but then again, at the end of it, you can see that, she's emotional. And that's a very important point. So the same patient can have a combination of epileptic and non-epileptic. That's the most challenging. And I'll just show you one example of that. The two T seizure types. You see here, so far I've shown only one seizure type. Here there are two seizure types. Seizure 1, seizure 2. The seizure 1 is she gets some vague headache. And then she has these prominent chewing automatisms and is unaware, occasional generalized tonic-clonic. But the second type, again the same headache, but then she falls down and is very still. No movements, no response to calling, no sphincteric incontinence. The frequency of both are pretty high. Every month, about 4. And she had a very nice lesion in the parahippocampal gyrus. That's dysplasia there. So we were very sure that that is the PET also shows. There's no problem with that. And I'll just show you that first video where she has this prominent chewing automatisms. Even the mother doesn't know, not yet recognized it as a seizure. And she is unaware. She's watching the television, but she is, you can see she's become very still. And she's got this very prominent chewing automatisms. And the mother still has not yet recognized. And it's only now that the mother knows, oh yeah, something happened to my child. And then she alerts. This is a true seizure. This is a complex partial seizure of temporal type. Hypomotor, no eye movement, and unaware. And the EEG shows a very nice ictal transformation, very nice on the right temporal lobe, which is concordant with that MRI lesion. So that's no problem with that. That's type 1. Now the type 2, you see the type 2 now. That's type 1. I will now go to the. Now that's another one. Sorry, that the initial one was the type 1. This is the type 2. You just see what happens. Just see what the same person, and then she suddenly drops. That's it. She suddenly drops like that, and she's completely unaware. This is just like that 12-year-old boy I showed. The same way of falling. It's the slow fall. But when the parents give the history, they tell the person just suddenly falls off. That's how it is. Slow fall. And you can see that the EEG at this time is completely normal, the simultaneous EEG. So 2 types in the same patient. So we could interact with the relatives telling that type 1, you get rid of this type 2, we'll cure the type 1. In 9 months, they said, well, we told that this is how you distinguish between the 2 types, and they were well aware of it. And you see what we did. This was in 2012, and then we operated on her in 2003, and she's completely normal. She doesn't have type 1 nor type 2 now. So that, so the combination is a very important point. That then the final point, the last part of this talk, in the next 5 minutes or so, I will finish, is epileptic seizures, which look like non-epileptic, and they are diagnosed as non-epileptic. So there, the epilepsy, the non-epileptic were misdiagnosed as epileptic seizures. Here, the epileptic seizures are being misdiagnosed as non-epileptic seizures. And you see the consequences of that. Invariably, they come from the frontal lobe. Very rarely, they come from the temporal lobe. And the reason for that is, and especially, it's not the whole frontal lobe. It is in this region, the prefrontal, premotor, anterior, anterior premotor, posterior prefrontal, anterior prefrontal, and the orbitofrontal cortex. These are the regions that that are responsible for these kind of seizures, which are hyperkinetic and they are distressful. And I'm going to show you 4 videos, and you just see how this person, or 24-year-old person, you just see what happens. You just see whether it resembles any seizure at all. You see that? This is called stereotypy, proximal stereotypy, rhythmic movements. But actually, subtly, there's already a posturing of the left hand, but that's difficult to make out. And then there is what is called an ictal pout, which is a chapeau di fenda. You see that the prominent pout of the mouth. That's a typical feature of this particular location. Then there is a ictal body turn. You see that? Now, this is a hyperkinetic, hypermotor seizure of a frontal lobe. And this is invariably mistaken as a non-epileptic seizure. But actually, it's epilepsy. So that's the thing. The frontal lobe is a great mimicker, and the repertoire of symptoms can be so wide. And I'll show you some more. So that's one. And you see this lady had a cingulate gyrus dysplasia. You can see that very tiny dysplasia there. The cingulate gyrus on the right side. And you see her seizure. Myself and my colleague are interviewing her. This is in 2006. And it lasted only about 12 seconds. Abrupt onset. We were interviewing her, asking her history. All of a sudden, she started screaming. And this is a feature of extreme fear, which is usually seen in the cingulum or the orbitofrontal cortex. Abrupt offset. They immediately recover. Something like non-epileptic. So that's the thing. And they recover immediately. So abrupt onset, brief duration, abrupt offset, but stereotypical. You record 100 seizures, it will be the same. And the EEG is usually normal because it comes so deep from the brain. It is not seen on the scalp. So the normal EEG, that's how they get misdiagnosed as non-epileptic. And we just removed her cingulate that dysplasia, and she's completely normal. She even tried to commit suicide. Here she had psychopathology for a genuine epilepsy. Because nobody was believing her. The neurologists were not believing her. They were all telling, no, you're faking it. And she got so fed up, she tried to commit suicide. So we analyzed her, and that was in Sri Chitra, many years ago. I'll show you one more video in Sri Chitra at the same time, a very dramatic video of this gentleman who every night he'll get these attacks, and his neighbors complain because you just see how he screams. In fact, it's so loud that, and you see the distress. And it came from the left superior frontal gyrus, anterior most part. And he gets exhausted. It lasted only about maybe about 7-8 seconds. That's it. Now you see this another type of a nocturnal frontal lobe epilepsy, which again is a very complex. You see this gentleman who's sleeping all during video telemetry. This was in Global a few years back. And you see very complex movements. You see that kind of, cuneiform, very abnormal posturing. And you see the cycling movements, bicycling, bipedal automatisms. These can be mistaken. And then he gets up, sits up. He's from Iraq, actually. And then he does this kind of very naturalistic, almost like a namaz position. And then he becomes all right. So that's, again, all these things can be mistaken as non-epileptic seizures. And then, but the most dramatic one is the last one. This is the last set of videos of a 47-year-old gentleman. And if you just watch this video and just see whether it's really a seizure or not, for 20 years, he's been going on without, like even initially, I made a diagnosis of non-epileptic some 7 years back. I revisited him just about 2 years back. Just observe this gentleman. And I don't think many people will say that this is actually epileptic. It's very funny. It's very difficult to even describe it. He just suddenly crouches and then he does this kind of, repetitive movements, almost like cycling, but it's a very unnatural kind of a cyclical movements. Very difficult to say that this is actually an epileptic seizure. So it's not. I'll show you one more video of this gentleman from one side now. See that? It's a very, very funny kind of. You see this? It's like he's doing this repetitive movements. But the only point was that these are all stereotype. So that's the paroxysmal stereotype movements, not lasting for more than about maybe 10-15 seconds. So these were the points. And the very interesting point here is, finally we managed to get a very nice rhythm in the midline. And this is at the beginning. And the next slide shows that very nice rhythmic feedback. That's in the left frontal, on the right frontal. And he had a very tiny calcific speck. And these seizures generally come from the anterior frontal. I was just telling, it never comes from the posterior frontal. And we saw just this tiny calcific speck. And that was the region, this middle superior frontal gyrus. And he underwent a very tiny resection of that particular, completely normal. He's off all anti-epileptic. So, epileptic seizures mimicking non-epileptic. So, in summary, this is the last slide. In summary, very important to listen to the patient, the eyewitness. Encourage patients and attendants to get the Hope video because you can actually analyze that. And PNES can be diagnosed in the outpatient. It's not a diagnosis of exclusion. It is always a diagnosis of inclusion. Both epileptic and non-epileptic seizures can exist in the same patient. Treat each event in each patient as an independent individual event. Never think that, okay, this and that are, just because one type is there, he or she is going to get only that type. They may have both. And video EEG used judiciously can be helpful in the diagnosis. So thank you very much for your patient understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Dinesh Naik, for that wonderful presentation. And that's the magical tuning fork I was talking about. You could see in every case. For me, he looked more like a stage hypnotist, inducing hypnosis, inducing epilepsy at will. And some of the photographs you showed, sometimes you are familiar in stage hypnosis, right? So It is really excellent on one side how psychogenic non-epileptic seizures can be treated with multiple anti-seizure medication. In fact, I have come across at least 4 cases which are treated with intubation in ICU as status epilepticus were weaned off, and we could come out with psychopathology. And also the second type is said, a patient having psychogenic non-epileptic seizure in the background of a seizure, part 1 and part 2, as you rightly said. That is where the difficulty comes. But if you could really watch the episodes like the stereotype, as you rightly said, they are different. The fingerprint of part 1 is different, part 2 is different, so you should be able to distinguish. And frontal lobe seizure, do they always occur in sleep, or?
Yeah, I mean,
because there is one scale called frontal lobe epilepsy parasomnia scale.
Flip scale. Most of them occur from sleep, and but about 10 to 15% of them can occur during wakefulness.
Okay.
And it's only when it happens in wakefulness that the diagnosis comes out in the open. So that's
because almost all the frontal lobe epilepsy cases you go, nobody recognized probably as epilepsy, thinking more into automatism and things like that. So, and as you rightly pointed, in fact, one of our neurosurgeons, Dr. Harun, he was not there when you were there. He will ask, when you are taking an EEG, clinically the case is epilepsy, the EEG is negative. Are you going to stop treating? And if the patient is clinically non-epileptic, EEG source findings, are you going to start treating?
correct.
So what's the value of EEG? That's the question you used to ask. And you also rightly said, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures can have EEG positive finding, and true seizures may not sometimes correlate. So one of the famous statements, absence of evidence is not an evidence for absence. So some of the points you highlighted very well. I leave it to my co-chair and probably to the floor for any questions.
Thank you, sir. It's very lucid presentation. And nothing too much add from my side. Now it is open for discussion.
I also join hands of Dr. Srinivas to say thanks to you for bringing such a wonderful clippings. So much of information you have given through the clippings. Amazing, sir. Thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
So I had a patient. Thank you. Really thank you. I had a patient of 40 years of age, about 100 of pseudo seizures. All the families come up. Within it lasts for 10 minutes of time, and then they all go off. One day he had come down and then had a seizure, and we all thought it was a pseudo seizure. And then we were waiting to him get up and go off. He couldn't. It was about 1 hour. I had rushed to the patient and found that he is totally unconscious.
Oh.
Immediately referred to the hospital and then got the investigations done, found that there is a bleed in the brain.
Correct.
You know, I think it is a clinician part too. Every time you should examine and then investigate.
Yeah.
That's a caution.
That's true. Yeah. That's exactly
So
the
question
point.
is, what are the conditions where you continue to give AEDs for lifetime, sir? What are the conditions where you give AEDs for lifetime?
No, his question is, like, is there anywhere you stop the anti-epileptic medication, or in some cases you deem it to be necessary to continue it for the rest of the life?
For non-epileptic
Not
seizures?
non-epileptic, epileptic.
For epileptic, oh yeah. I mean, see the concept of lifetime treatment is slowly changing in the sense that we try to cover that for idiopathic generalized epilepsy. That's the only condition which actually requires a very prolonged treatment. All other conditions, we can actually try to start tapering them down at the end of arbitrarily 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And first time it may be unsuccessful, but the second time can be successful. So every time we have to have that plan of tapering. at the end of 2 years or 4 years.
Any other questions?
We request PSR Ganesan sir to hand over the memento to our chairperson.
Okay, if there are no questions, we conclude the session. Once again, we congratulate Dr. Dinesh Naik for that
Thank you.
wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you
And
so much.
as rightly pointed out, excellent clips so that we could really witness your clinic. Thank you.
I request chairpersons to hand over the memento to the speaker.
Thank you. Oh, sir.
Thank you, sir. That was really an informative and fascinating session, sir. Thank you so much. I request all the dignitaries to attend the valedictory function on Hall A.